The letter in my mailbox was bright pink, and I knew immediately it was trouble because the Clearwater Hills HOA only used that color paper when they wanted to make someone's life miserable. I stood there in my driveway in Boulder, Colorado, holding this ridiculous piece of paper that claimed I was being fined $500 for environmental violations related to improper smoke coloration emanating from residential chimney structure. I read it 3 times before the words actually registered. They were fining me for the color of my smoke, the actual color. Not because I was burning something illegal, not because the smoke was excessive, but because apparently the shade of gray coming out of my chimney didn't meet their aesthetic standards. My name is Oliver Winters, and I had moved into this neighborhood 6 months ago thinking I had found paradise. The house was a beautiful 2-story craftsman with a real wood-burning fireplace, nestled in the foothills with a view of the mountains that took my breath away every morning. The HOA seemed reasonable during the buying process. They had rules, sure, but nothing that seemed particularly invasive. I should have known better. I walked back inside, the pink paper crumpling slightly in my grip. My golden retriever, Murphy, followed me into the kitchen where I spread the letter out on the counter to read it again, hoping I had somehow misunderstood. Notice of violation. Resident of 4782 Pinecrest Drive is hereby notified that on January 15, 2025, at approximately 7:30 p.m., inspection revealed smoke emanating from said property's chimney in a color described as excessively white or clear, which violates Section 14.7 of the Clearwater Hills HOA Covenant regarding visual pollution standards. This type of smoke coloration suggests improper burning techniques that may pose risks to community air quality standards. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Jake, who had recommended this neighborhood to me. Jake, did you ever get fined for your smoke being too clear? What? Oliver, what are you talking about? The HOA just fined me $500 because my chimney smoke is too white. There was a long pause. That's insane. I burn wood all the time. They have never said anything to me about smoke color. Well, apparently they have a problem with mine. I took a breath, trying to calm down. Who even inspects smoke color? Who has that job? Let me guess. Deborah Patterson was the one who signed it. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the letter. Sure enough, there it was in aggressive cursive. Deborah Patterson, HOA president. She's new. Took over about 2 months ago. I heard she was intense, but this is next level. After I hung up with Jake, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called a professional. If they were going to claim I was burning incorrectly, I wanted an expert to tell me whether that was true. I found a chimney sweep company with excellent reviews called Mountain Peak Chimney Services and scheduled an appointment for the next day. That evening, I sat in front of my fireplace, staring at the wood I had carefully stacked. I had done everything right. I had bought seasoned hardwood from a reputable supplier, stored it properly in my covered wood shed, and only burned it after making sure it was dry. I even had a moisture meter that I used to check the wood before burning. Everything I had read online said I was doing it correctly. The next morning, a white van pulled up with Mountain Peak Chimney Services printed on the side. A man in his 50s climbed out, wearing work coveralls and carrying a toolbox. He introduced himself as Richard Torres and had the weathered look of someone who had been cleaning chimneys for decades. "So, you got an HOA complaint?" he asked as I led him inside. "They fined me because my smoke is too clear. I did not even know that was possible." Richard let out a low whistle. "Too clear? That is a first. Usually, people complain about smoke being too dark or too thick. Clear smoke means you are burning efficiently." That is what I thought, but I wanted a professional opinion. He spent the next hour inspecting everything. He climbed onto my roof to check the chimney cap and flashing, used cameras to inspect the flue, checked my fireplace damper, and even examined my wood supply. When he was done, he came back into the living room and set down his equipment. "Mr. Winters, your setup is actually one of the best I have seen. Your wood is properly seasoned, sitting at about 12% moisture content, which is perfect. Your chimney draws beautifully, no blockages, no creosote buildup. The reason your smoke is so clear is because you are burning efficiently. When wood is dry and burns at the right temperature, you get almost complete combustion. That means very little visible smoke, and what you do see is mostly water vapor and carbon dioxide. It is exactly what you want." I felt vindicated but also more confused. "So the HOA is fining me for doing things right. Sounds like it. I will write you up a full report. You can use it to fight the fine." He paused, pulling out a tablet to type up notes. "You know what usually causes dark smoke? Burning green wood or wet wood. That creates thick, dark smoke full of particulates. That is actually bad for air quality. What you are doing is good for air quality." Richard finished his report and emailed it to me before he left. I printed it out immediately and read through his detailed assessment. Everything was documented, including photos and measurements. He had even included references to EPA guidelines on efficient wood burning. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, which according to the community website was scheduled for that Thursday evening at the community center. Thursday came, and I walked into the Clearwater Hills Community Center carrying a folder with Richard's report, my wood supplier receipts, and printouts from the EPA website. The meeting room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. About 20 other residents were scattered around the room. Deborah Patterson sat in the center of the board table. She was exactly what I expected. A woman in her mid-40s with an aggressively styled blonde bob, wearing a blazer that looked too formal for a neighborhood meeting. She had the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes. The meeting started with routine business. Deborah went through financial reports in a clipped tone, approved some landscaping proposals, and discussed upcoming community events. I waited for the open forum section, my folder growing damp in my hands. "We will now open the floor for resident concerns," Deborah finally announced. "Please state your name and address clearly." I stood up. "Oliver Winters, 4782 Pinecrest Drive. I received a violation notice regarding smoke from my chimney, and I would like to address it." Deborah's expression did not change. "Yes, Mr. Winters. Your property was observed producing unusual smoke coloration that does not meet community standards. I had a professional chimney sweep inspect my entire system. According to him, clear smoke means I am burning efficiently. I have his full report here, along with EPA guidelines that support this." I walked up and placed the folder on the table. Deborah glanced at it but did not open it. "Our standards are based on maintaining consistent visual aesthetics throughout the neighborhood," she said. "When your smoke appears different from other residents, it creates visual disruption. But it is better for air quality. I am literally producing less pollution." Another board member, a thin man named Gerald Simmons, leaned forward. "The covenant is clear. Section 14.7 requires that all external elements, including smoke, maintain visual consistency with the neighborhood character." I could not believe what I was hearing. "You want me to burn less efficiently, to produce more pollution just so my smoke looks like everyone else's. We want you to comply with the covenant you agreed to when you purchased your home," Deborah said firmly. "The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay or contest it through the formal dispute process. which requires a written submission and a $100 filing fee. $100 to dispute a $500 fine that makes no sense. Those are the procedures, Mr. Winters. Deborah moved some papers around, clearly ready to move on. Next item of business. I stood there for a moment, feeling the anger build, but causing a scene would not help. I took my folder and returned to my seat, barely hearing the rest of the meeting through the buzz of frustration in my head. After the meeting ended, a few residents approached me in the parking lot. One of them was Jake, who clapped me on the shoulder. That was brutal, man. Deborah has been on a power trip since she took over. A woman I did not know introduced herself as Linda Ramirez. She fined us $300 because our holiday decorations were not taken down by January 3rd. We were out of town visiting family and got back on the 5th. $300 for being 2 days late. She fined the Hendersons because their lawn was a quarter-inch too long, added another man. They measured it with a ruler. Over the next 20 minutes, I heard story after story. Deborah had been systematically finding violations throughout the neighborhood, often for things that previous boards had never enforced. The fines were adding up, and several residents were genuinely struggling to pay them. Has anyone tried to fight back? I asked. Jake shook his head. The dispute process is designed to be expensive and time-consuming. Most people just pay the fine and try to avoid future violations. What if we organize, get a group together? Linda looked interested. Like what? A petition? I am not sure yet. But there has to be something in Colorado law about HOAs abusing their authority. Let me do some research. That night, I stayed up late reading Colorado's HOA statutes. I learned that while HOAs had broad authority, they were still bound by state law requiring them to act reasonably and in good faith. I found several cases where courts had overturned HOA fines for being arbitrary or overly restrictive. I also discovered that HOAs could be sued for selective enforcement if they were applying rules inconsistently. The next morning, I called a lawyer. His name was Marcus Chen, and he specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Boulder, in a modern building with mountain views. Marcus was younger than I expected, probably in his early 30s, but he had an impressive track record listed on his website. When I explained the situation, he actually laughed. They fined you for efficient burning. That is a new one. The chimney sweep said it is actually a good thing. But they want visual consistency, apparently. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers tapped together. Here is the thing about HOA covenants. They have to be reasonable and related to legitimate community interests. Maintaining property values, yes. Aesthetic consistency within reason, yes. But requiring residents to create more pollution for aesthetic purposes. That is going to be hard for them to defend, especially with an expert report stating you are meeting EPA standards. So, I have a case. You definitely have grounds to fight the fine. I would recommend we start with a formal demand letter pointing out the issues and requesting they withdraw the fine. If they refuse, we can take it to court. Colorado law also allows for attorney fees if we win, which means the HOA would have to pay my costs. How much would this cost me up front? I can write the demand letter for $500. If it goes to court, we would discuss contingency arrangements since attorney fees are recoverable. I agreed, and Marcus drafted a comprehensive letter citing the chimney sweeps report, EPA guidelines, Colorado HOA law, and case precedents. He sent it certified mail to Deborah Patterson and the HOA board. 2 weeks went by with no response. The 30-day deadline for paying or disputing the fine was approaching. I called Marcus. They are ignoring the letter, he said. Not surprising. Some HOA boards think they are immune to challenges. Let us file a formal dispute through their process. It will cost you the $100, but it creates a paper trail. Then if they deny it, we go to court. I wrote out the dispute, attached all my documentation, and submitted it with a check for $100. The HOA was required to respond within 15 business days. During this time, I connected with the other residents who had complaints about Deborah's enforcement tactics. We created a group chat and started documenting everything. Linda Ramirez had been fined for having a wreath on her door past January 3rd. The Hendersons had been cited for grass height, despite having a lawn service that followed HOA specifications. Another family, the Nuyens, had been fined because their car was parked in their driveway for more than 48 consecutive hours, even though they had been using it daily for work. We realized that Deborah was systematically targeting certain properties while ignoring identical situations at other homes. That was selective enforcement, and according to Marcus, it was legally actionable. On day 14 of the required response period, I received a letter from the HOA. My dispute had been denied. The reason given was simply that the board had reviewed the matter and determined the fine was appropriate based on Covenant Section 14.7. I forwarded the denial to Marcus immediately. "Perfect," he said when he called me back. "This is exactly what we needed. They did not address any of your evidence or the expert report. They just rubber-stamped their original decision. We can file in Boulder County District Court. What are our chances? Based on what you have told me and the documentation you have provided, I would say very good. But I also want to look into something else. You mentioned other residents being fined for selective enforcement issues." "Yes, quite a few. If you can get them to document everything and possibly join the suit, we could go after the board for a pattern of abuse of authority. That would have much bigger implications." I reached out to the group chat and explained what Marcus had said. 8 families agreed to meet with him, each bringing their own documentation of fines and violations. Marcus's eyes lit up as he reviewed the materials. "This is worse than I thought. Deborah Patterson has issued more fines in 3 months than the previous board issued in 2 years. And look at this pattern. All of the heavily fined properties are owned by younger families or recent move-ins. The established families, particularly Deborah's friends, have identical violations that are not being cited." Linda Ramirez pulled out photos on her phone. "Look, this is Karen Morrison's house, 3 doors down from me. She still has her Christmas lights up. It is February. I got fined $300 for having decorations up on January 5th. She is on the social committee with Deborah. And the Mitchells have had a boat parked in their driveway for 6 months, added Tom Henderson. We got cited for having our car in the driveway for 3 days straight. The Mitchells play golf with Deborah every Sunday." Marcus started making notes. "This is actionable. Colorado law is very clear that HOAs cannot selectively enforce rules. If we can prove a pattern, which we clearly can, we can challenge not just the fines but also potentially have the court order an audit of all of Deborah's enforcement actions." "What would that mean?" I asked. "It would mean every fine she has issued could be reviewed and potentially overturned. Plus, if we can show she is acting in bad faith, the board members could be held personally liable." That got everyone's attention. HOA board members were usually protected by something called the business judgment rule, which gave them broad discretion. But that protection went away if they acted in bad faith or outside the scope of their authority. Marcus filed a lawsuit on behalf of 9 families, including me. The complaint was detailed and damning. It included the chimney smoke issue, the selective enforcement pattern, photographic evidence of identical violations being ignored, and expert testimony about efficient burning practices. We asked the court to void all fines issued by Deborah Patterson's board, order a complete audit, and award attorney fees. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my phone would not stop ringing. Other residents had heard about it and wanted to know how they could join. Deborah had apparently fined dozens of people, and word was spreading fast. Marcus filed an amended complaint adding 17 more families. The case was growing into something much bigger than my $500 fine. On Friday afternoon, I was working from home when someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Deborah Patterson standing on my porch, alone. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway. "Can I help you, Mr. Winters? I think we got off on the wrong foot." Her voice was saccharine sweet, completely different from her tone at the meeting. "I wanted to come by personally to discuss your situation. My lawyer told me not to discuss the case. This is not about the case. This is neighbor to neighbor." She smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "I reviewed your dispute materials more carefully, and I think perhaps we were too hasty. What if we reduced your fine to $250 as a gesture of goodwill? What about everyone else you have fined?" Her smile tightened. "This is about your situation, Mr. Winters. So you want me to settle and drop out of the lawsuit? I am offering you a reasonable compromise. The reasonable compromise is admitting you were wrong and rescinding all these bogus fines. I am burning efficiently. I have expert testimony. You are literally asking me to pollute more." "Mr. Winters, I would hate to see this get ugly. Legal battles can be very expensive and time-consuming, and you never know how a judge might rule. I am willing to find out, and my lawyer says we have a strong case." Her expression hardened. "You are making a mistake. The HOA has significant legal resources, and we will fight this vigorously." "Good luck with that." I started to close the door. "You are going to regret this," she said, her voice losing all pretense of friendliness. "I will make sure of it." "Are you threatening me?" "I am simply stating facts. Life in this neighborhood can be very pleasant or very difficult. It is up to you which you prefer." I closed the door and immediately called Marcus to tell him about the conversation. "That was incredibly stupid of her," he said. "She just tried to intimidate a plaintiff in an active lawsuit." "Document everything. Write down exactly what she said while it is fresh. This actually helps our case." I wrote down every word I could remember. That evening, I also set up security cameras around my property. If Deborah was going to make things difficult, I wanted documentation. The next week, I found out what she meant by making life difficult. I received 3 new violation notices in 3 days. One claimed my garbage cans were visible from the street before collection day, even though I had just placed them out the night before, which was standard practice. Another cited me for having a ladder leaning against my house, which I had been using to clean my gutters that afternoon. The third claimed my outdoor light fixtures were not the approved style, even though they were the same fixtures that had been there when I bought the house. Each violation came with a $100 fine. I was not the only one. Every family in the lawsuit started receiving new violations. Linda Ramirez got cited for her mailbox being an unapproved shade of black. Tom Henderson was fined because his lawn had clover growing in it. The Nuyens received a violation for having toys visible in their backyard. Marcus amended our complaint again, adding harassment and retaliation claims. He also filed for an emergency injunction to stop the HOA from issuing new fines while the case was pending. The judge granted a temporary restraining order. Deborah was not allowed to issue any new fines to anyone in the lawsuit until after a preliminary hearing, which was scheduled for 3 weeks out. During those 3 weeks, I learned more about Deborah Patterson than I ever wanted to know. Some of the residents did some digging and discovered that she had been forced to resign from her previous HOA in Castle Rock after allegations of financial mismanagement. Nothing was ever proven, but several residents had complained that HOA funds were being spent on personal expenses. I brought this information to Marcus, who hired a forensic accountant to review Clearwater Hills HOA's financial records, which were supposed to be available to all residents upon request. When Marcus requested the records, the HOA board claimed they needed 2 weeks to compile everything. Colorado law required them to provide records within 10 business days. Marcus filed a motion to compel. The judge was not happy about the delay and ordered the HOA to produce all financial records within 48 hours or face sanctions. When the records finally arrived, the forensic accountant spent a week going through them. What he found was disturbing. Deborah had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. Dinners at expensive restaurants were labeled as board meetings, but the dates did not match any official meetings. There were charges for a weekend stay at a luxury resort in Aspen labeled as a community planning retreat, but no other board members had attended. More than $15,000 in HOA funds had been spent on what appeared to be personal expenses over the 3 months Deborah had been president. Marcus immediately amended our lawsuit to include allegations of embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. He also filed a separate motion asking the court to remove Deborah from the board and appoint a temporary receiver to manage HOA affairs. Things escalated quickly. The local newspaper, the Daily Camera, picked up the story. A reporter named Sarah Kim called me for an interview. I agreed, and the article ran on the front page of the local section. Boulder HOA president faces embezzlement allegations amid bizarre fines. The article detailed the smoke color fine, the selective enforcement, and the missing HOA funds. It included interviews with several residents and quotes from Marcus about the legal case. Most damaging was a quote from Richard Torres, my chimney sweep, explaining that clear smoke was actually good for the environment. The story went viral locally. People loved the absurdity of being fined for burning efficiently. The environmental angle made it even more newsworthy since Boulder was known for being environmentally conscious. 2 days after the article ran, a different reporter contacted me. This one was from a Denver television station. They wanted to do a feature story for the evening news. I called a meeting with all the families involved in the lawsuit. This is getting bigger than we expected. Are we comfortable with television coverage? Linda Ramirez spoke up. I say yes. The more attention this gets, the harder it is for them to hide what they are doing. Everyone agreed. We did a group interview with the television crew in my living room, with my fireplace burning efficiently in the background. Richard Torres even agreed to appear on camera to explain the science of efficient wood burning. The segment aired during the 6 o'clock news and was picked up by the network's national morning show. Suddenly, our small HOA dispute was national news. The story had everything: an absurd fine, environmental implications, embezzlement allegations, and the classic tale of HOA overreach. My phone started ringing with media requests. Good Morning America wanted to interview me via satellite. The story was picked up by CNN and Fox News. Social media exploded with people sharing their own HOA horror stories. The attention had an immediate effect. Several board members resigned, claiming they had no knowledge of Deborah's actions. That left only Deborah and Gerald Simmons on the board, which meant they no longer had a quorum to conduct official business. Marcus filed an emergency motion asking the court to appoint a receiver immediately since the HOA could no longer function. The judge granted it that same day and appointed a retired attorney named Helen Robertson to manage HOA affairs until new elections could be held. Helen's first act was to suspend all fines issued under Deborah's tenure pending review. Her second act was to hire an independent auditor to review all financial records. Meanwhile, Marcus had referred the financial information to the Boulder County District Attorney's Office. Embezzlement of HOA funds was a crime under Colorado law, and if the amounts exceeded certain thresholds, it could be a felony. I was in my kitchen making dinner when I saw the police cars pull up to Deborah's house, 4 doors down. I watched through my window as 2 officers went to her door. They were there for about 15 minutes before Deborah emerged in handcuffs. The DA had moved fast. Based on the forensic accountant's report and the HOA financial records, they had enough evidence to charge Deborah with felony theft and embezzlement. The charges alleged she had stolen more than $20,000 from the HOA over 3 months, which under Colorado law was a Class 4 felony carrying a potential sentence of 2 to 6 years in prison. Gerald Simmons was also arrested the same day on charges of being an accessory. The investigation revealed he had known about some of Deborah's spending and had approved certain questionable expenses. The arrests made national news. Our case had evolved from a quirky story about smoke color into a serious criminal matter. News crews camped out in the neighborhood for days. The criminal case moved on its own track, but our civil lawsuit continued. Helen Robertson, the court-appointed receiver, worked with Marcus to review every fine issued during Deborah's tenure. Out of 237 fines totaling more than $60,000, she determined that over 80% were either invalid, selective enforcement, or excessive. The remaining board members who had not resigned, realizing they could be held personally liable, agreed to a settlement. The HOA would rescind all fines issued during Deborah's presidency, reimburse anyone who had already paid, and cover all attorney fees for the lawsuit. They also agreed to revise the covenant enforcement procedures to include oversight and appeal mechanisms that did not require expensive filing fees. The settlement was approved by the judge in April, 4 months after I had received that first pink violation notice. The independent audit revealed that Deborah had actually stolen closer to $30,000. She had been creating fake vendor invoices and paying them to a shell company she controlled. The additional charges were added to her criminal case. Her trial was scheduled for August. In the meantime, she was released on bail with an ankle monitor and prohibited from holding any HOA position in Colorado. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Helen Robertson organized new elections, and a slate of reasonable candidates was elected to the board. Jake actually ran and won a seat, promising to focus on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. One evening in May, I was sitting on my back deck watching the sun set over the mountains, Murphy lying at my feet. Richard Torres had come by earlier in the day to do my annual chimney inspection and cleaning. Everything was still in perfect shape, and he had once again praised my burning technique. My phone rang. It was Marcus. I wanted to give you an update. Deborah's lawyer approached the DA about a plea deal. She is looking at pleading guilty to avoid trial. What kind of deal? They are discussing felony theft with a recommended sentence of 3 years, suspended to 2 with probation. She would have to pay full restitution to the HOA plus penalties. That seems light for what she did. It is, but the DA thinks it is appropriate given that it is her first offense and she is cooperating. The important thing is she will have a felony conviction, which means she can never serve on an HOA board again in Colorado. I will take it. I just want this done. There is one more thing. Several news organizations want to do follow-up stories. They are calling it the efficient burning case. You have become something of a folk hero in the anti-HOA movement. I laughed. That was not what I was going for. I just wanted to burn wood in my fireplace. Well, you have inspired a lot of people. I have had a dozen new clients in the past month, all with HOA disputes. People are realizing they do not have to just accept whatever their board demands. After I hung up with Marcus, I thought about everything that had happened. 4 months ago, I had just wanted to enjoy my fireplace on cold winter nights. Instead, I had ended up taking down a corrupt HOA president and changing how enforcement worked in my entire neighborhood. The story made its way through various legal blogs and homeowner rights websites. I started getting invited to speak at community meetings in other HOA neighborhoods. I always declined. I was not looking for attention. I just wanted to live my life. The criminal case concluded in July when Deborah accepted the plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony theft and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with all but 60 days suspended. She would serve the 60 days on weekends at the Boulder County Jail, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay $32,000 in restitution, plus fines and court costs. Gerald Simmons pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of official misconduct and received a suspended sentence with community service. The civil settlement was finalized around the same time. Everyone who had been fined received full refunds. I got my original $500 fine back, plus the additional $400 in bogus fines Deborah had issued in retaliation, plus the $100 dispute filing fee. The HOA also paid Marcus's attorney fees, which totaled almost $40,000. More importantly, the new board implemented real reforms. Violation notices now had to include photographic evidence and specific covenant citations. All fines could be appealed to a hearing panel made up of randomly selected residents, not just board members. Filing a dispute no longer required a fee, and enforcement inspections had to be documented and consistent across all properties, with monthly public reports showing all violations cited and the properties involved. Jake, serving on the new board, told me they were also working on revising some of the more outdated and restrictive covenants. The smoke color provision is definitely getting cut, he said over beers one evening. Along with a bunch of other ridiculous stuff the original developer put in 30 years ago. Summer arrived, and I did not need my fireplace. But I started preparing for the next winter, cutting and stacking wood in my shed. I had become something of an expert in efficient wood burning, and I actually started helping neighbors improve their own burning techniques. Several people asked me for advice on wood selection, seasoning, and fireplace maintenance. In August, the Daily Camera did a follow-up article on the 1-year anniversary of Deborah's election as HOA president. They interviewed residents about how the neighborhood had changed. The overall sentiment was relief. People felt like they could enjoy their homes again without constantly worrying about arbitrary fines. One cool evening in September, I lit my first fire of the season. I followed all the same practices I had used before: properly seasoned wood, good airflow, optimal temperature. The smoke that rose from my chimney was clear and nearly invisible, just like it should be. Murphy and I sat by the fire, and I thought about how a simple letter in my mailbox had led to months of legal battles, national news coverage, and real change in how HOAs operated, at least in our community. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda Ramirez. She had sent a photo of her own fireplace with a caption, "Burning efficiently, just like you taught me." Several other neighbors sent similar messages over the following weeks. The neighborhood had bonded over the shared experience of standing up to an abusive board. We had a community barbecue in October where people who had never spoken before were now friends. The lawsuit had inadvertently created exactly what an HOA was supposed to create, a real sense of community. Marcus called me in November with news that several Colorado state legislators were introducing a bill to reform HOA regulations statewide. The proposed law would require independent oversight of HOA boards, mandatory transparency in enforcement actions, and caps on fine amounts. They were calling it the Fair Housing Association Practices Act. "Your case is being cited as an example of why these reforms are needed," Marcus said. "You might get invited to testify if the bill moves forward." "I just wanted to burn wood," I repeated my now familiar refrain. "I know, but you have created something bigger. People need to know they have rights, even in HOAs." December arrived with heavy snow. My fireplace got a workout and my chimney continued to produce efficient, clean, burning smoke. No one complained. The new board was focused on actual community improvements like better snow removal and updating the playground equipment. I was taking Murphy for a walk one evening when I ran into Helen Robertson, who still lived in the neighborhood even though her role as receiver had ended. "You know, I have been managing HOA disputes for 20 years, she said. "I have never seen anything quite like what happened here. Usually, people just pay the fines and suffer in silence." "I think a lot of us were at a breaking point," I said. Deborah pushed too hard and picked the wrong issue to fight over. The smoke color fine was so absurd it made everything else she did look absurd too. If she had just focused on normal violations, she might have gotten away with the embezzlement for much longer. Silver lining, I guess. Helen smiled. "You did a good thing, Oliver. This neighborhood is better because you fought back." As the year drew to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened. What started as an incomprehensible fine for something I was doing correctly had turned into a complete transformation of how our HOA operated. Deborah Patterson was now a convicted felon, serving her weekend jail sentences and working to pay restitution. Gerald Simmons had resigned in disgrace. The old guard of petty enforcement was gone, replaced by people who actually wanted to build community. On New Year's Eve, I hosted a small gathering at my house. Jake and his family came over, along with Linda and several other neighbors who had been part of the lawsuit. We stood around my fireplace, which burned with its characteristic clean efficiency, and toasted to the new year. "To efficient burning," Jake said, raising his glass. "To standing up for what is right," Linda added. "To community," I said, and we all drank. As my guests left that night, I stood on my porch watching the snow fall gently in the streetlights. Smoke rose from several chimneys up and down the block, some dark and sooty, some clear and efficient. Nobody was measuring or judging or fining. People were just living their lives, keeping their homes warm on a cold Colorado night. Murphy barked from inside, wanting his dinner. I went back in, added another log to the fire, and settled onto my couch. The legal battle was over, the bad actors were gone, and the neighborhood was healing. My $500 fine for smoke color had cost the HOA tens of thousands in legal fees and restitution, ended a corrupt board president's reign, and inspired reform efforts across the state. I pulled up the EPA guidelines on my phone, the same ones Richard Torres had referenced in his initial report. There it was in black and white. Clear, nearly invisible smoke indicated optimal combustion efficiency, minimal particulate emissions, and proper wood burning technique. Everything I had been doing was not just right, it was exemplary. The next morning, January 1st, I woke up to 6 inches of fresh snow. After breakfast, I went out to my woodshed to bring in more logs. The wood was perfectly seasoned, sitting under cover at optimal moisture content. I had enough to last through February at least. As I was stacking wood by my fireplace, my doorbell rang. It was Tom Henderson, holding a moisture meter. "Hey, Oliver, sorry to bother you. I bought this meter after hearing you talk about it at the barbecue. Can you help me figure out if my wood is dry enough?" I spent the next hour teaching Tom how to properly test wood moisture and explaining the science of efficient burning. Before he left, 2 other neighbors had stopped by with similar questions. I realized I had accidentally become the neighborhood's wood-burning expert. Over the next few weeks, I helped a dozen different families improve their fireplace techniques. Several people invested in better wood storage. A few bought moisture meters. One neighbor even had Richard Torres come out to inspect and clean his chimney after years of neglect. The air quality in the neighborhood noticeably improved. On cold nights, instead of a thick haze of smoke hanging over the area, there were just gentle wisps rising from chimneys. The difference was visible and measurable. In February, I was contacted by Colorado Public Radio. They wanted to do a story about how grassroots action could reform HOAs. I agreed to an interview, which aired during the morning drive time. The host was particularly interested in how something as absurd as a smoke color fine had exposed deeper corruption. "You think Deborah Patterson would have been caught if she had not issued that initial fine against you?" the host asked. I thought about it. Probably not immediately. She was smart enough to hide the embezzlement pretty well, but she was getting more and more aggressive with the fines. Eventually, someone would have pushed back. I just happened to be the one with a really clear-cut case that was easy to prove was wrong. What advice would you give to other homeowners dealing with problematic HOAs? Document everything. Get expert opinions when possible. Know your state laws, and do not be afraid to stand up for yourself. HOA boards have authority, but they are not above the law. If they are acting unreasonably or in bad faith, you have legal recourse. The interview resonated with listeners. CPR's website posted it as a podcast, and it was downloaded thousands of times. I started getting emails from people across the country sharing their own HOA horror stories and asking for advice. I could not help everyone, but I started compiling resources. I created a simple website with links to Colorado HOA laws, attorney referrals, tips for documenting violations, and information about homeowner rights. Marcus helped me make sure all the legal information was accurate. The website got more traffic than I expected. I added a forum where people could share their experiences and advice. It became a small but active community of people dealing with difficult HOAs. In March, the state legislative hearing for the Fair Housing Association Practices Act took place. I was invited to testify, along with several other homeowners who had fought HOA battles. I took a day off work and drove down to the state capitol in Denver. The hearing room was packed. On one side were homeowners and consumer advocates. On the other were HOA management companies and attorneys arguing that too much regulation would make it difficult for HOAs to function effectively. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I told my story. The pink letter, the absurd fine, the expert report that proved I was right, the retaliatory violations, and the discovery of embezzlement. I emphasized that reasonable oversight and transparency would not hurt legitimate HOA operations, but would protect homeowners from abuse. I was not trying to be difficult, I said. I was just using my fireplace the way it was designed to be used. When I proved with expert testimony that I was actually doing everything right, the board doubled down instead of admitting their mistake. That is when we found out about the deeper problems. If there had been proper oversight and transparent enforcement from the beginning, none of this would have been necessary. The bill passed the committee and moved forward to the full legislature. It would take months to work through the process, but it was a start. By April, spring had arrived and I did not need my fireplace anymore. But the changes that had started with that pink letter continued to ripple outward. Our neighborhood held elections for the remainder of the board positions, and a diverse group of engaged residents was elected. They immediately started working on updating the covenants to remove outdated and overly restrictive provisions. The smoke color provision was one of the first to go. In its place, the new board adopted language that simply required residents to follow EPA guidelines for wood burning, which meant encouraging efficient burning rather than punishing it. Linda Ramirez was elected to the Architectural Review Committee and started streamlining the approval process for home improvements. The old system had required board approval for even minor changes, with applications taking months and costing fees. The new system designated certain improvements as pre-approved as long as they met basic guidelines. The transformation was dramatic. In 1 year, we had gone from a neighborhood where people were afraid to put up a wreath, without checking the rules, to a place where reasonable improvements and maintenance could be done without bureaucratic nightmares. Jake organized a neighborhood barbecue in May to celebrate the new board and the completion of the reforms. Nearly every household attended. People brought food, kids played in the park, and there was a genuine sense of community that had been missing before. Deborah Patterson's name came up a few times, usually with dark humor. She had completed her weekend jail sentences and was now on probation, working to pay back the restitution. According to the neighborhood gossip, she had moved to a rental apartment in Longmont and was working in retail. Her reputation was destroyed, and she would carry a felony conviction for the rest of her life. I almost felt sorry for her. She had let a little bit of power go to her head and made increasingly bad decisions until she crossed into criminal territory. If she had just been a reasonable HOA president, focusing on legitimate community needs, none of this would have happened. But she had chosen to be petty and vindictive, and then compounded it by stealing from the community she was supposed to serve. She had earned her fate. Gerald Simmons had moved away entirely, relocating to Arizona to live near family. He avoided jail time with his plea deal, but his involvement in the scandal had cost him his job and his reputation. As summer settled in, life returned to a comfortable normalcy. I worked my job as a software engineer, spent weekends hiking in the mountains with Murphy, and enjoyed my home without fear of arbitrary fines. Richard Torres stopped by in June to check on things. "I have been getting a lot of business from your neighborhood," he said. "People are actually taking fireplace maintenance seriously now." "That is good," I said. "Efficient burning is better for everyone. You know, in 20 years of doing this work, I have never seen anyone get fined for burning too efficiently. I tell that story to all my customers now. They love it." The case had taken on a life of its own in the world of HOA disputes. Legal blogs analyzed it, property law professors used it as a teaching example, and homeowner rights advocates cited it as a reason for reform. I gave a few more interviews, always emphasizing the same points. Know your rights, document everything, and do not be afraid to challenge authority when it is wrong. By August, the Fair Housing Association Practices Act had passed both chambers of the Colorado legislature and was signed into law by the governor. It would take effect on January 1st of the following year. The new law required HOA boards to follow transparent enforcement procedures, limited fine amounts based on the severity of violations, required independent review of financial records, and created a state office to handle complaints about HOA abuses. It was not perfect, but it was a significant improvement, and my case was cited in the legislative history as one of the key examples that demonstrated the need for reform. September came around, and with it the cool evenings that made a fire pleasant. I lit my first fire of the second season in my home, using the same techniques that had started this whole journey. Clear, efficient smoke rose from my chimney, and I sat contentedly in my living room, Murphy snoring on the rug. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Jake. Board meeting tomorrow night. We are officially closing the books on all the legal stuff from last year. Thought you would want to know. I attended the meeting, held in the community center. The new board went through the final accounting of everything related to Deborah's tenure. All fines had been refunded. All legal fees had been paid. The insurance company had covered most of the costs, though the HOA had to pay a significant deductible. Deborah's restitution payments were coming in slowly through a court-ordered payment plan. The total cost to the HOA was approximately $55,000, the treasurer reported. But we have recovered about $30,000 through restitution and insurance, with more expected over the next few years as Deborah continues making payments. The bigger cost was to community trust, Jake added, but I think we have rebuilt that. We have new procedures, new leadership, and a new approach. This neighborhood is stronger now than it was before all this happened. People applauded. It was true. The shared experience of standing up to corruption had brought people together in ways that normal HOA activities never could. After the meeting, several people thanked me for starting the fight. I always deflected credit to Marcus, to the other families who joined the lawsuit, to Helen Robertson, and to everyone who worked to create positive change. But privately, I knew that it had started with me refusing to accept an unjust fine. If I had just paid the $500 and moved on, Deborah would still be in power, still embezzling funds, still making people's lives miserable with petty violations. Sometimes standing up for yourself on a small issue leads to exposing much bigger problems. October brought the first snow of the season, earlier than usual. My fireplace worked perfectly, my wood was properly seasoned, and my chimney swept cleanly. No one measured my smoke. No one cared what color it was. I was just a homeowner burning wood to stay warm, exactly as things should be on a cold night in November. I was sitting by the fire working on my laptop when I got an email from a journalist writing a book about HOA abuses. She wanted to include my case as a chapter and was asking for permission to interview me in depth. I thought about it for a few days before responding. Part of me just wanted to move on and let the whole thing fade into the past. But another part recognized that sharing the story might help other people dealing with similar situations. I agreed to the interview, which took place over several hours in my living room. The journalist, whose name was Patricia Huang, was thorough and thoughtful. She wanted to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. "What do you think is the broader lesson from your experience?" she asked. "I think it is about power and accountability," I said. "HOAs are given a lot of authority over people's homes and lives. When that authority is not balanced with accountability and oversight, it can be abused. My case was extreme, but it illustrates the problem. Deborah felt like she could do whatever she wanted because no one had ever seriously challenged the board before. And now we have systems in place to prevent that. But it required people standing up and demanding change. That is the real lesson. You cannot just assume authority figures will act reasonably. You have to hold them accountable. The interview was published the following spring as part of Patricia's book, Governed: The Fight for Homeowner Rights in Modern America. My case was featured prominently, along with several other examples of HOA overreach across the country. By the second anniversary of receiving that pink letter, my life had settled into a comfortable routine. I had become something of an accidental activist, known in certain circles as the guy who fought his HOA over smoke color. But mostly I was just Oliver Winters, a guy who lived in Boulder, worked in tech, and enjoyed burning wood in his fireplace. The neighborhood had fully healed. Property values had actually increased, partly because the reforms made it a more desirable place to live. People were not afraid of their HOA anymore. The board functioned as it was supposed to, maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and addressing legitimate concerns. Enforcement was rare and reasonable when it happened. Deborah Patterson finished her probation after 3 years. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved out of state, starting over somewhere in Florida. I never saw her again, which was fine with me. The state HOA reform law was working. The new oversight office had received hundreds of complaints in its first year and had successfully mediated many disputes that previously would have ended up in expensive litigation. The cap on fines prevented the kind of excessive penalties Deborah had imposed. Other states started looking at Colorado's law as a model. I was contacted by advocacy groups in California, Texas, and Florida, all dealing with their own HOA horror stories. I shared what I had learned and pointed them toward resources, but I made it clear I was not looking to become a professional advocate. I had my own life to live. 3 years after the initial fine, I was invited back to testify at the state capitol about how the HOA reform law was working. I told the legislators that from my perspective as someone who had lived through both the worst and best of HOA governance, the reforms were making a real difference. Before the law passed, fighting an unjust fine meant hiring a lawyer and spending thousands of dollars, I said. Now there are free mediation services and clear standards for what HOAs can and cannot do. That evens the playing field and protects homeowners who do not have the resources for a legal battle. The hearing was covered by local news, and once again, my story made the rounds. But this time, it was not about the absurdity of the smoke color fine. It was about how positive change was possible when people worked together. As I drove home from Denver that day, I thought about everything that had happened because I refused to accept an unjust $500 fine. A corrupt HOA president had been removed and convicted. Tens of thousands of dollars in bogus fines had been refunded. An entire neighborhood had been reformed. State law had been changed, and countless other homeowners had been inspired to stand up for their rights. All because my smoke was too clear. I pulled into my driveway and Murphy greeted me at the door, tail wagging. I made dinner, lit a fire, and settled in for the evening. The smoke rising from my chimney was clean and efficient, exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been from the start. I had never asked to become the face of HOA reform. I had just wanted to use my fireplace without being harassed. But life had taken me on an unexpected journey, and I had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply stand up and say no when authority oversteps its bounds. The fire crackled. Murphy sighed contentedly, and outside my window the lights of Boulder twinkled against the backdrop of the mountains. Everything was exactly as it should be, and my smoke, burning efficiently into the cold Colorado night, remained perfectly, beautifully clear.